Maya Poets, my favorite Israeli spy and lesbian. How's it going?
I'm doing very well, especially now that I'm here with you.
Oh, that's
How are
sweet.
you?
I'm doing pretty good myself. So we've had quite the adventure in the past few days, including just now. We got like halfway into our interview before we realized neither of our cameras were recording. That
I
was
love
pretty
it.
fun.
Love it when
And
that
you,
happens.
yeah, never had that happen before actually. And you've had quite the adventure for really the past few years of your life, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
We should get into that.
Let's get into that.
So give us a little introduction of yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Maya. I'm newly 25.
Happy
Thank
birthday!
you. Thank you very much.
We're off by a few months, but it's okay.
True. In a few years.
A few
But
years. What do you mean? You said newly 25.
yes, but you're newly 20.
Oh, I see what it is. All right.
Okay. So I started identifying as trans at the age of 12 in the year 2012. And I was trans identified for 12 years. So by the time I stopped the process of transition, it had hijacked half of my life. And, I discovered the idea of trans because I got an iPad for my 12th birthday. And,
Great start.
yeah, lovely start, right? Common origin story.
Good way to
Kid,
start your adolescence.
oh, amazing. Wouldn't trade it for anything else. Yeah, so that happened, and I guess a lot of things were going on in my life, which sort of made me question whether or not I was really a girl. It first started with one day in Arabic class when we were engaging in the American cultural ritual of passing a stack of worksheets down. I mean, every American is familiar with the idea of take one, pass it down.
Sure.
So I was engaging in this classroom cultural ritual, and my hand briefly brushed by the hands of one of my female classmates. And suddenly I started to experience a bunch of really new, odd, destabilizing sensations in my body. I noticed that my heart started to race. I became flushed. I became very warm. I felt kind of dizzy. And when I opened my mouth to apologize to this girl for the brief brush of our hands, I realized that no words came out.
Sounds like a crush.
Yeah, it was a crush, but I didn't really know what a crush was. I thought that crush was the orange soda, and I thought that my peer group was just obsessed with it in the same way as they were obsessed with, Pokemon cards or silly bands or penny boards. So I thought that it was, an ephemeral obsession of the peer group, and nothing worthy of note there. But I, as a kid, was very much obsessed with like really rare medical conditions. My first research obsession was probably started when I was probably 8 or 9, and it
It's pretty
was
young.
yeah, but it wasn't trans. It was about the world's tallest people, and I had noticed that from my research that all of these super tall people all shared a an affliction, which was basically a rare brain tumor, a rare tumor on the pituitary gland of their brain, which caused their bodies to continually release growth hormone, and this led to very like consistent and extreme and asymmetric growth. So by that age of 8 or 9, I had basically taken it upon myself to try to figure out, is there a way to excise this tumor without harming the surrounding functions of the brain? So, that obsession basically gave me a lot of internet research skills. And from that
It's quite an
obsession,
interesting obsession for a kid of that age. I
I
mean,
know
when I think of myself at that age, I was just like playing Minecraft nonstop and drawing all over my schoolwork.
that I'd say is, much more age appropriate. Um, yeah. Um, and I guess in my case, because I'd been doing so much medical research and because I had the brain of a child, I'd come to the conclusion that any deviation away from homeostasis is probably a sign of pathology. So I have all these odd sensations in my body, and naturally, I must be sick. So I go into WebMD, I type in all of my symptoms, and I'm generated a list of 3 possible neurodegenerative conditions that might kill me pretty shortly. So I thought, okay, I can't tell anybody really about this because, if I'm gonna die, like I don't want to know. Like I need to live the rest of my years to the fullest. But what I did notice is that if I was hanging around a group of boys, I didn't feel all of these odd, destabilizing sensations in my body. So I thought, oh, like I'm not ill, right? And so
So what do you
I
think it was?
what did I think? I thought that, well, for some period of time, I thought that I had gotten some kind of disease from handling the same stack of worksheets that were handled by a bunch of teenage boys who never washed themselves. So at first I thought that, maybe I had gotten some illness from the worksheets.
But the symptoms only present around women.
Yes, right. But I didn't put two and two together. And so I just kind of hung around this group of boys, and we formed a strategic alliance through which we would incessantly prank the teachers. And we noticed that our pranks would elicit laughter from the girls. So, we did that, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't discuss it beforehand, but it just seemed to be the goal that everybody was going for. So that was happening.
A little grassroots operation here.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it certainly was, the antics of childhood naivete, I suppose. And with these boys, I guess, like, I had just gone from a school that required uniforms to a school where we could wear whatever we wanted
Mm.
to. And so I'd started to develop a sense of style around that age. And because those boys were my peers, my friends, I wanted to dress like them. But even more than that, I wanted to dress like Ellen DeGeneres because I had seen a couple of clips of her show, and I liked her suits, her vests. I thought she was very dapper. I wanted to dress like her. And, I had gotten some sort of ideas from certain adults around me that this is really quite unacceptable behavior, that it's very, I guess, non-conforming in a way which would not be seen in a, I guess, as socially desirable
For women.
for women to dress, yeah, in these ways. And you know so I basically just, I felt so much shame, upon being told that my desires and my wishes just to dress in different clothes were pretty unacceptable.
But I mean, just what were you wearing?
Well, I mean, I was kind of wearing whatever I was allowed to wear, really. There was a lot of just wearing like the most androgynous things that I could get away with. I was Ellen DeGeneres one year for Halloween. It was kind of an uphill battle to to wear that costume, but I'd acquired some nice Oxfords and a vest, and I treasured those. So I developed, a lot of shame around wanting to dress the way that I wanted to dress, precisely because it was unacceptable for girls. And because I grew up in a West Coast progressive city, I had seen men undergoing sex changes, as they were called at that time. And I'd also heard about this concept on the radio. So, I guess a lot of stuff was going on in my life at that time, and I just decided to go on the internet, as I had done many times before, in search of an answer to my questions. And I asked Google.
Which is the place to go, right?
I know, right? Most reliable source.
It can be.
Can be, yeah,
Can be. Other
can be,
times
and
it's a real wild card, isn't it?
oh, it absolutely is. And I Googled, whether it was possible for girls to change sex and become boys. And I got my answer within, first it was medical journals describing all these different procedures and medical interventions, and then it got into the videos of, quote unquote trans kids and FTMs, and um, that sort of, I got my answer, and I latched onto it for half of my life.
Pretty early on too. Like not only in your own life, you were 12 years old, but this is also 2012, right? Before the huge blow up of the trans ideology into the mainstream.
Absolutely, I guess you could say I was a pioneer. Yeah.
Old school.
Yeah, for a while, yeah, I did think of myself as more of an old school transsexual. I was like, I'm 3 years ahead of all the rest of the Gen
Did
Zers.
you identify more with the term transsexual than transgender?
You
I know
know,
there's like a
I
big debate about around that right now.
Yeah, there's a big debate around that now. I'd say that for myself, I mean, I didn't even necessarily think of myself as transgender. I just thought,
Just as a guy.
yeah, I mean, I think it started as like, oh, I have like a guy's brain, and I need to correct my female body to match my male brain.
That's the idea that I really latched on. Is that what got you into it?
100%.
I feel like that's like the brain sex theory in particular really appeals to these kids who are neurodivergent or just outside the box thinkers who tend to be more logical, and also more curious about the world
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, the reason why you see so many intelligent and highly curious kids getting wrapped up in
and
this
often
stuff.
autistic.
Yeah, they're often autistic. But like often, when autism is discussed, I think that in regards to trans identification, often I think the term autism is used and it's sort of in a way that sort of stops the conversation where it really ought to start. Like we need to sort of talk a bit more about
Mhm.
like which specific autistic traits, whether or not they're present in somebody who is diagnosed, whether or not they're present in a person who has a preponderance large enough of these traits in order to even receive a diagnosis. I think that it's not just people who have like the formal diagnosis of autism. I think I mean, in my case, and I don't have a diagnosis of autism, I have a diagnosis of ADHD. But
Right.
in my case, the way I see these traits manifesting is just the nature of hyperfixation, of not really understanding social norms and expectations, and so therefore, like not n- you know when I had that chance to develop my sense of style for the first time, I didn't model myself after the girls because I didn't realize that that was really what was expected of me. I just was drawn to what I was drawn to. And then I got, messages that this was unacceptable. And precisely because I've been known to not pick up on social norms, that, people felt like they had to go out of their way to really inform me that what I wanted to do was at odds with the social norm because it was basically just seen as yet another thing I'm not picking up on.
You did sound like a very atypical kid. I
Yeah.
feel like in a lot of ways, and just the way that you're talking about this now, we were pretty similar as kids. I feel like we would have made good friends. We're pretty good friends now, so
Yeah. It would have been awesome to be friends with you as a kid because I think that
probably would have gotten us out of this
we
or
might have.
prevented it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to know for sure,
Right.
right? But yeah, at least we're friends now. I mean,
And that's what matters.
that's what matters. Yeah.
You were very curious about eventually transitioning became essentially a hyperfixation of yours. When do you start to connect it with yourself personally?
I'd say that maybe within a week or two of hyperfixating on all of these different procedures that could be done to change sex, that, maybe a couple weeks after finding out about, I guess, all these different options that I had, I started to connect it to myself. Like the original
Mhm.
hyperfixation was not with like these videos of women tracking their, testosterone timeline through a series of updates. Like I was really fascinated by the procedures themselves, by like what was happening, what do the puberty blockers do and the cross-sex hormones and the different procedures that were available. And like, of course I wanted to know if it was possible for girls to change sex for a reason, presumably because I wanted to become a boy, because I wanted to be able to wear the types of clothes that I wanted to wear without it being considered socially to be like really abnormal.
And you had moments during your childhood where you just considered yourself to be a boy, right?
Well, I would say that I didn't have any real sense of self as a kid. It's not that I thought of myself as a boy per se, but there were definitely moments as a kid, when like I didn't
Mhm.
develop the understanding or the cognitive milestone of sex constancy by the time that most kids develop it. And sex constancy is basically the understanding that a kid arrives to, really it starts to develop, probably around 6 7 when the kid develops more complex reasoning skills. And I hit puberty probably at about 9.5, and I was born quite early. I weighed 1 kilogram when I was born. So I had a bunch of really odd developmental issues really from the outset. And so my development was delayed in some ways. It was precocious in other ways. But one of those delays was that I didn't come to a full understanding that biological sex is immutable, right? That I was born a girl and that means I'm going to grow up to be a woman. That's sex constancy. And it's a really
Mhm.
key milestone for kids to reach. And if they don't reach it, by a predetermined sort of by within the normal range of ages, then
Which
it's a
which
sign of
would what would
developmental
that be
delay. You know,
roughly?
I think that most kids maybe start developing sex constancy like it's like a casual and long process that starts with, kids about the age of 3 noticing that boys and girls tend to wear different clothes and have different lengths of hair. And 3 and 4 year olds will think that if a boy puts on a dress, he's literally a girl because they haven't. I think it has something to do with object permanence.
Makes
And
sense.
then they get a little bit older and they realize that, oh, there are more roles associated with whether somebody's a boy or a girl. But it's only maybe starting around 5, maybe going into age 6 and 7, when kids really solidify the understanding that, there are boys and there are girls, and that your body parts determine whether or not you're a boy or a girl, and that there are sort of the social roles and tendencies that kids tend to think of as absolutes still even at that age, but they do fundamentally at some point start to realize that biological sex is immutable.
Okay.
And for me, that just didn't happen like by the time I hit puberty. So I
Quite
thought,
a dangerous combo.
oh, totally. And so I was, naturally pretty distressed about that. I mean, I thought for a period of time that I would just sprout male genitals, that mine just hadn't, grown in yet.
It's
I
very imaginative.
Yeah, I was a very I lived in my imagination as a kid, and simultaneously, I was a very literal child, like highly, highly literal. I wasn't able to read between the lines of what people were saying, and some of that is probably just normal kid behavior. But for me, like, I guess none of this really developed beyond that stage, like as a natural form of development. Of course, now when I'm trying to interpret sort of what people aren't saying when they are saying things, I have to use logic in order to figure out, like, is this sarcasm? Is this a lie?
Right.
Like, what rhetorical techniques are these people using? So I guess a lot of just kind of chaotic and atypical development was happening. And it was just really a storm of factors that led me to, want to get a sex change.
So when you start seeing yourself as a boy, what did you do? What did you do to pursue maybe socially transitioning, and what was the response of the people around you?
So I was not affirmed when I came out as trans in 2012, at the age of 12. Yeah, nobody affirmed me, and but I still wanted to adopt, a more masculine appearance. I wanted to have shorter haircuts. I wanted to wear more of the clothes that I really wanted to wear, and
Which is something that you were pretty much already doing.
I mean, as a kid, I went to a school where we had uniforms and it
Yeah.
was a year-round school. So there wasn't, I sort of just wore whatever my parents, put me in. And I have a brother of a similar age. And so we would often exchange clothes, but I basically just kind of like went with the flow. I mean, unless the fabric was really itchy, like I remember the tights on the uniform just being so horrendously itchy. And so, of course, when I was discovering these ideas around trans, like, when people on the internet were saying, "Oh, like you didn't like to wear dresses, and it
It's
means
like,
that you're
huh, me
trans,"
neither.
right? And it's like, huh, but I didn't connect it to the fact that I just couldn't stand the texture of the garments, and like, yeah, like I think that men's clothes tend to be a lot more comfortable than women's clothes. There are pockets and it's much more practical. You can play. And those are all things that kids like to do. So it would make sense that I came to that incorrect, conclusion about myself. But as far as socially transitioning goes, like because I wasn't affirmed and I had to be very persistent and stubborn in order to wear, kind of compromises of what I actually wanted to wear, the most androgynous things in the women's section. I did that for several years, and then when I went away to university at the age of 18, I thought, well, now's my chance to finally start, the process of socially transitioning. So I just introduced myself, under a male name to people. But of course, everybody in the United States knew that I was female, and they just asked what my pronouns were because that had become the campus culture at that point in time.
Around,
And
what year was this?
about 2017, yeah.
Sounds
So
sounds about right.
yeah, that was around the time I think when really this stuff started to explode in a much more significant way, even from the moment that Time Magazine declared the transgender tipping point. Like this, of course, my social transition started a few years after that, but it had become far more widespread by the time that I had started the social transition. And I knew that nobody was actually taking me seriously as a guy. Like I didn't like being asked what my pronouns were.
It's a frustrating environment to transition.
It's very frustrating because you have to declare it to everybody all the time, including to people who you don't want to know. And I was like hanging out with a lot of Arabs, like more so than I was hanging out with the trans community at my university because I'd been studying Arabic since I was 12. And I was far more interested in that than I was, in any way engaging with the trans community. Um, and I absolutely hated when those two worlds merged.
Sounds like a chaotic merge, if anything.
Yeah, it was chaotic, and it made me just think like, God, like I really just need to start the medicalization process immediately because I don't want to ever be asked my pronouns like
You wanna
ever
feel like you're
again.
being taken seriously.
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess the next major shift in my story happened at that time when my family sort of realized that the trans identity wasn't going away, and they were, pretty obviously concerned about that. And so they said, "Look, you really need to study abroad for a year in a country that doesn't support all of these ideas. You can't go to Europe or a Western country." And so I picked Israel. And there were really a few things that happened on my initial trip to Israel before even the study abroad that made me realize that while in the United States, the way I present myself gets me, perceived as a masculine woman, in Israel, I can present myself in the same exact way and just be taken seriously as a man. So that's sort of when I started my, mystical gender journey, like for real. Like it felt so much more real when I moved to the Middle East and people just took me seriously as a guy because they didn't know what a masculine lesbian was or a masculine woman.
The sex roles over there are quite a lot more strictly enforced there. So it's so interesting to me when you tell me that, like, you actually passed as a member of the opposite sex, as a male there, because when I look at you now, and when I look back on those photos that you show me of your time there, I just see a butch woman.
Yeah, I would say that it's a more, I guess, I mean, you're a Westerner, so it makes sense that you would see that. In the Middle East, I guess all of these sex cues are read in a totally different way. It's much more based on sort of superficial features like haircuts and clothes. And of course, I was wearing a binder. I was, squashing my breasts for 7 years, and that was obviously integral in my ability to pass as a man. But it was actually just incredibly easy for me to go into men's spaces and be taken seriously and have nobody question why I'm there. While in the few times that I did try to access women's spaces, um, I got a lot of blowback. I had security escort me, away from the women's side of the Western Wall at one point. I've had a lot of incidents in women's bathrooms over there because everybody just thinks that all the women just thought I was like a teenage boy entering their space. So, and women are supposed to be better at detecting somebody's sex than men are. But yet, even the women, even women who are like biologically programmed to figure out who's male and who's female, to figure out like who is a threat and who's a potential mate and who is not, like, I guess that biological hardwiring seemed to be really significantly overridden by
By
just the sex, the sort of, not even the sex cues, but like the
just
more
cultural
the
things.
cultural things, or the what the trans activists would refer to as the gender cues, right?
Yeah, so it sounds like your experience transitioning socially in the Middle East was markedly different than in the environment of an American college campus. I mean, what was that like? That sounds like quite the experience.
Oh yeah, it was novel. It was fantastic. I mean, I had so much fun. I was doing what I'd always wanted to do. I guess I can just tell you a couple stories from that time.
So how did it start?
So it started when I was like on an 11-day trip to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at an institute in Jerusalem. I was there with the girl I was dating at the time, and once the institute was over, we found ourselves in the West Bank. We were traveling from one city to the next, and we were lugging around our massive suitcases, and we'd gotten off at the wrong stop on the shared taxi, meaning that we were in the wrong city entirely. And because Google Maps had not yet made their appearance within the West Bank by 2018, 2019, it felt like very old school. I mean, we had to like use our mouths and actually ask people directions.
The way that we're meant to.
Yeah, right. Back in the Stone Age, right? The way that people navigated. And so we were lugging around our massive suitcases, and Finally, we had stumbled into a coffee shop in the West Bank, and the owner of the coffee shop can tell that we're tourists. He becomes super excited. He welcomes us in. My girlfriend and I sit down at a table with him. He gives us free hot dogs and free coffee. And we look around, and there's a foosball table, and there are all different like types of games in there. And we're just surrounded by men watching sports, or playing table sports. Like, we're just surrounded by men. Everybody in that cafe, they're all men. And this is because in the Arab world, and in most Arab cities,
Mm,
I'd say that Arab culture is very homosocial,
mhm.
meaning sex segregated, and it's generally understood implicitly that there are places where men congregate and there are other places where women congregate. And of course, tourists are not expected to know all these rules, so tourists get away with things that locals would never be able to.
Makes sense.
And so my and I were in this cafe and talking to this very kind owner who was just giving us like free food and coffee. And we had this incredible conversation. He told us about our life. He told us about family he has in the United States. He was excited to practice his English, but I wanted to practice my Arabic. That's what I was there for. And so I told him, look, I speak a little bit of Arabic. And his eyes light up and he starts speaking to me in Arabic. And Arabic and Hebrew are both very gendered languages. And so he starts asking me questions, and he refers to me in the masculine. And that's the
He thought
moment.
you were a boy.
Exactly. That's the moment in which I realized that while, in the United States, this style of presentation would get me read as a masculine female, and yeah, they might ask pronouns or whatever, but they would understand
Bothersome.
what's going on. But in the Middle East, doing the same exact thing gets me perceived as a guy, which is what I had always, like, since the age of 12, wanted to do. And so I figured that this was my chance to live as a guy.
I mean, how do you feel in that moment though? Would you say you like felt like the rush or like that feeling of affirmation that like people often speak of?
Yeah, I would say that I felt very affirmed. I felt excited. I felt as if, wow, like, if this is how well I'm able to pass even without hormones or surgery, like, imagine how well I will pass with those interventions.
And what a novel, exciting feeling. It
Oh
just
yeah.
makes you want to go, it just makes you want to pursue it further.
Oh, absolutely, because you're always chasing that hit of dopamine. You're always chasing that rush. And I did all kinds of things in the Middle East to try to, further increase my chances of experiencing that rush. I mean, I would go into the West Bank. I did a lot of peace activities with Jews and Arabs, like in Bedouin villages. Bedouins are nomadic Arabs. And I would sleep over in these villages with all these other, peace activist community members. And I had to sleep in the binder, because I was really worried for my own safety that somebody would find out that I'm actually female.
How couldn't you be? I
Right.
mean, it is a very dangerous situation that to put oneself in,
Oh, yeah. Like, I was putting myself in all kinds of situations where I look back on it now, and I
especially in
really,
the Middle East.
especially in the Middle East, where I really think about, like, wow, something really bad could have happened to me. And I was totally naive and totally unaware, even as I was 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, totally unaware of what I was getting myself into.
You pretty much passed perfectly well as the opposite sex. What do you learn about being a male socially, even like just within like the cultural context of being in the Middle East?
I would say that I learned a lot about the psyches of young men who live in, conflict zones, and specifically, about why we see so many young men getting drawn and lured into jihadism. Of course, in those societies, they're taught really from toddlerhood on that their greatest calling in life is to become a martyr for Islam, to become a suicide bomber or to engage in other types of terrorist activities, that the best, thing they could do with their lives is to murder as many Jews as is humanly possible. So of course they're imbued with these radical, dangerous beliefs from a very young age, but it really ramps up around puberty, around adolescence and young adulthood, especially before these young guys before they get married.
When you're trying
Because
to find your purpose and
when you're
build your identity.
yeah, when you're trying to find your purpose, and when you're a young man filled with testosterone, and you have all of these physical drives to connect intimately, and you're in a culture where that is just so not allowed, like, it would make sense to me as to why these young men they're fueled with all this testosterone. They've been taught these ideas that are really dangerous and radical, and they don't have any outlet, for expressing any of these like sensations or these drivers.
And how they deal with that.
I think that that's why a lot of these young men between probably the ages of maybe 14 and 25 or 26, like why we see so many terrorists being between those ages, because they have zero emotional regulation. They're flooded with hormones. They live in a really restrictive society where there are basically very few socially acceptable ways for them to express their, adolescent angst. And in lieu of many socially acceptable, ways to manage those feelings or those drives or just the, push of testosterone.
I feel like I see like a parallel here with like these mass shooters and terrorists, for example, in the United States. Except over there, it seems to be like a cultural norm almost.
Right. It's one of the culturally acceptable ways for men to channel their rage. And it's channeled in ways that are quite literally suicidal and homicidal, and it's culturally glorified. So I think I understand, being around so many young men and being kind of among them, I realized that, but I also realized that these men have a certain complexity to their emotions that, you know, I couldn't even fully recognize until I'm reflecting on it now, and that they certainly couldn't recognize. And, they put a lot of, I guess a lot of responsibilities on their shoulders, and a lot of them, especially the ones that speak English, if they want to do something like experiment with drinking, for example. Like, I think I related so much to my Palestinian friends because they were living a double life, many of them. We'd go out to bars and drink, and they were always really paranoid that somebody was going to take a picture of them and post it on the internet and that their parents would see it. And in a very similar way, I was really worried that somebody who, from my past who knew me as a woman would also proliferate those pictures, or that somebody would stumble, across pictures of myself when I was much younger,
Right.
like maybe on Facebook. Like I was very careful with which social media I gave out. Like I had to basically, so we shared a lot of worries. Like there's always, I guess I've always seen these parallels between like this, like there are so many parallels I see between like this jihadi radicalization and like the radicalization into gender ideology and the sort of measures that are needed to take in order to enforce or materialize these kind of immaterial abstract ideas.
Right. I mean, in more ways than one, you really were living two lives at once, not only with trying not to get caught transitioning by your own family, but also just the act of trying to present yourself as a man. And through that, you were literally putting yourself in the shoes of these young men who you're surrounded by.
Absolutely.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it was a fascinating experience. And yeah, it's just kind of crazy to think about the fact that I actually did that. Like that I took all these measures in order to pass. And it's crazy to think about the fact that I got out of it. And it's also crazy for me to contemplate the reality that I didn't need a single doctor to sign off on anything that I did to myself, whether it be the social transition or the 7 years of binding. And even though I didn't need a doctor to sign off on any of these interventions, I still did significant harm to my psyche and my body. And I don't know to what extent the bodily harm that I've sustained through 7 years of constant binding can even be reversed.
That's one thing that I'm incredibly frustrated about. Um, that being, people tend to see the stories of these sisters or those of us who haven't medically transitioned as having less weight and less importance than the stories of those of us who have medicalized. When really, I mean, talking to those of you who have only desisted, in a lot of ways, you've had just as much damage in your lives, and especially not only psychologically, but even physically from things like binding or tucking.
Yeah, binding and tucking are interventions that don't require a doctor to sign off on them, but they're incredibly dangerous, and I feel like there's a certain lack of discussion about how dangerous binding is. Most of the time, when I hear binding being discussed, it's more that binding is bad because it reinforces the trans identity, and the reinforcement of the or the reinforcing of the trans identity is what catalyzes medicalization. And both of these things are true,
Sure.
but let us not forget that binding in and of itself and tucking as well are extremely, extremely powerful, not only psychosocial interventions, but also physical interventions that can bring about harm to the body. And this harm, binding is so uncomfortable that binding alone will make a girl want to, remove her breasts entirely.
I mean, what exactly has it done to your body? What have the effects been?
So I would say that 7+ years of binding, what it essentially did is that, the skin on my chest has become much less elastic. So changes in weight don't necessarily mean that the breasts will sort of
Become
snap back
fuller?
to the shape, their new shape. Yeah, it's basically like I don't have the skin in that part of my body. I don't have the skin that somebody of my age probably would, in the elasticity
Mm,
and the sort of,
so it sags a little bit.
yeah. And I would also say that I have breathing issues now because in a binder you can't take a full deep breath because your lungs are constricted.
I mean, you're literally compressing your breasts into your rib cage.
Yeah. And I have had to relearn how to breathe like all over again because I trained myself to not take deep breaths for so many years that, at first when I had to try to take deep breaths, it kind of hurt a little bit because I was like so out of practice. There are definitely times when the breast tissue itself hurts quite a bit, and not just, at times that you would expect it to, like high intensity exercise, or maybe, before the menstrual cycle. It's just kind of, you know, pain that's kind of constant and ever present, no matter if I'm able to find, a properly supportive bra, or even if I'm not doing like really high intensity exercise,
I
like
was
the
going
pain
to
is
say,
ever
I mean, it
present.
sounds like that's a pretty like that's something that's pretty common, but I could imagine that the binding for years has only exacerbated that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you were still, I mean, you started binding at what age?
At age 18.
So your breasts probably were still developing at that time.
Yeah, almost certainly. Almost certainly. Yeah. I think about it, and, you know, I just can't believe that. I guess when I try to think about that whole chapter of my life, I try to give myself, some empathy, because like all of us came to the conclusions that we came to, probably the best and most, informed conclusions that we could have based on the information that was provided to us. The problem is that the information that was provided to us, upon which we based our decisions,
Mm,
was flawed. It was incorrect.
right.
It was totally ideological, not in any way factual, based on false premises and logical obfuscations. And it was, you have all these bad ideas that have now totally infiltrated every institution within Western society. So every society, from schools to the courts, to doctors, are all going along with these bad ideas and reinforcing them. So the problem, when everybody wants to, put all of this blame onto detransitioners or desisters for having taken these steps and these interventions, we can't pretend as if these are all people who are just totally illogical and totally irrational. Like, we were all acting, you know, we had a problem. We tried, we found this specific framework to understand the problem. And then we found this, this framework offered us a very seductive solution.
Right. And it's the fault of these institutions that they keep telling us to trust.
Absolutely.
So to circle back to your story, when did you say the turning point was in your transition?
So I would say that I attribute the process of my psychological desistance, or at least the start of it, to my first war in Israel, which would have been in May of 2021. I would attribute it to some moments that I had in and out of bomb shelters. I was getting ready with a different girl that I was with at the time. We were getting ready to see a show and we hear a siren. And I look at my girlfriend and I ask her, what is this? And she says, this is a siren. They're launching rockets at us. And I said, well, what are we supposed to do? And she looks at me and she says, we need to go to a bomb shelter. And then I look at her and then I ask, well, where's the bomb shelter? And then she just says, like, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So the first few sirens, we run to the bottom level of the apartment complex because you're much less likely to get hit by either a rocket or rocket debris
Mm,
on the lower level. And we eventually find the bomb shelter. Um,
that that sounds horrific. Did you know that this was something that was possible for you to live through during your time there?
I mean, I knew it happened in Israel. I knew this type of stuff happened, but
Did you ever expect it to happen?
I mean, knowing that wars happen intellectually does not really prepare you for living through wars.
Sure.
And there was one time when I didn't make it to a bomb shelter in time, and so I just ended up hiding under a tree, and I just saw like three rockets like, shooting above my head, one right after the other. The ground is like shaking underneath you as the missiles are being intercepted. So I was kind of contemplating my own mortality in those moments, and I sort of had like this passing thought, which was essentially like I just imagined myself in a hospital bed recovering from top surgery, or as it would be more accurately referred to, non euphemistically, as an elective radical double mastectomy. And I just imagined myself in a hospital bed, not being able to lift my hands above my shoulders, hearing a siren, and not being able to save myself, not being able to run, and just thinking, what would come of me then? Um, but I didn't do anything with that seed of doubt because in the middle of war, you're not really able to, if you have a rational thought or a thought that could lead to a rational revelation, you're not exactly able to follow up on that because it's life and death.
And the process of detransitioning psychologically tends to be pretty lengthy too, already.
Oh, yeah. It was, from this moment in 2021, I mean, I didn't totally give up trying to pass as a man until really like very late in the fall of 2023. And I was constantly immersing myself in gender critical ideas, really because I guess the next part of the journey that happened that was really important for this aspect of the character arc was really that um, during war, your whole life gets put on hold. Like I didn't shower for 11 days because I was really scared that I'd be in the shower and hear a siren and that I would just need to wrap a towel around myself and run to the bomb shelter with like soap in my hair. So I just didn't shower. And the only activity that I really did was something that I could stop at any moment and run if I needed to, which was just spending hours on social media. And on social media, I was confronted by all of my like lefty American friends basically justifying that Israelis should be living under rocket fire and justifying any action, any terrorist action as some kind of like liberatory force for the liberation of Palestine.
Right, the
And
Western Free Palestine movement.
absolutely,
How
so
absolutely sheltered.
oh, totally. Like these young people don't know what they're talking about, but neither did I until I moved to the Middle East and lived
And you
through
saw it
war.
for yourself.
I saw it for myself and I was worried for my Israeli friends and my Palestinian friends because I have friends in Gaza, friends that I'd met in online peace groups and friends I'd met abroad. And I was worried for all of us. I wanted this to stop. But all these Westerners just wanted to pretend as if this was some kind of a football match where they could pick sides and just watch us destroy each
It
other.
really is like a sport for them. It's
Yeah,
so disconnected from reality and from humanity.
yeah, exactly. For what was for them a sport, for us was our lives, our terrifying, tortured lives. And so I just thought that, these are all kids that I knew from high school debates. So,
Mhm.
I trust their ability to accept logical arguments, and I trusted my ability to form logically coherent and consistent arguments using, ethos, pathos, and logos and incorporating credible sources. And I just thought, if I provide them with a good enough argument, they will incorporate it within their logical analysis. So
If there's if there's one thing that I've learned from graduating high school and going my own way into adulthood away from my high school friends, it's exactly that group of friends that tends to be like that, like ideologically captured. I
oh,
don't know
they're
what it is, but this seems to be like a pretty universal experience.
yes. as Elon Musk would call it, the woke mind virus. Um, but anyways, I spent so much time on the internet searching for pro-Israel media in order to form these cogent arguments and present them to my friends on the internet
Mhm.
in hopes of convincing them that even if they don't care about the Jews, which I was already convinced by then that they don't, like that they don't even really care about the Palestinians,
No.
um, because they're willing to, support a terrorist group that when it's not hell bent on, destroying the Jews in Israel, that it is hell bent on basically, policing the Palestinian territories with an iron fist, and with really illiberal laws that none of these Westerners would support if they just knew what happens to gay people in those parts of the world. I mean, I had a friend who was killed in an honor killing, by his own family members because they found out that he was gay, and I and my this honor killing had not this had happened after my first war. But I basically spent a lot of time on the internet in pro-Israel sources,
I mean,
and
it was just common knowledge that that's the culture in the Middle East. Just 10 years ago.
I
And
know,
now we have this Queers for Palestine movement.
I know. It's ridiculous. Um, wow. Yeah.
It's
Um,
very interesting, this little intersection between, like, your experience there, um, culturally and with the war and with this whole gender thing. That's one of the things that I'm so I love, I wouldn't say love, that I'm fascinated about
mhm.
most with your story.
Yeah, I think that for me, like the arc of gender and the arc of sort of living through wars, like there's no way of really tearing them apart from each other because they're so interlinked. Um, because as I was doing this, is this pro-Israel research to basically show these people that even if you don't care about the Jews, you shouldn't support Hamas because they also make Palestinians' lives a living hell and make it, impossible for Palestinians to get a state because Hamas is not some kind of secular government. They're not even nationalists. They're jihadis. Jihadis don't believe in borders. Borders are an obstruction to their Islamic caliphate, right? They're not trying to establish statehood. So I tried to get through this, point through my friends' heads, and they weren't listening. And rather than, taking my arguments and kind of integrating them within their own logical calculus, they just started slinging ad hominem attacks at me, calling me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. And
That had to be a major wake-up call for you.
oh, it totally was. Not only was it a major wake up call for me, but because I'd been doing so much pro Israel research, the algorithm started to feed me more information that was in line with the basket of acceptable ideas to which the pro Israel position belonged
Mm.
in the latest iteration of the American culture wars, which would have been the right wing. So I started to get, the algorithm started to feed me more information about like Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests that were raging, in the previous year.
Mm.
And eventually, I started stumbling on content which critiqued, the transgender movement and gender ideology, and I'd started to see the stories of detransitioners pop up. And I actually clicked on them. I didn't run away from the dissonance because I'd always wondered, whether there would be a way for me to just become comfortable living as a woman.
Mm.
Um, I I really did want that, but I just didn't think it was possible because I was told if you have these feelings, it means you have gender dysphoria, and the only treatment for gender dysphoria is a medical transition.
And you also already had such strict ideas of what men and women were supposed to be like as well.
Right,
That were probably
exactly.
reinforced by the environment that you're in the Middle East.
Oh, 100%. And when I started seeing the first videos of detransitioners, I didn't see a single video of a detransitioner that was like myself,
Mm.
in some pretty key ways. Most of the videos of detransitioners that I saw were they were mostly feminine and heterosexual.
Mhm.
And so I thought, well, if this is a type of person who regrets the transition, which to me seemed pretty obvious that when I saw those women in the wild, transitioning, I thought this just seems like a bad idea.
Right.
So it wasn't really, shocking to me that a very feminine woman who is likely to grow up to be straight and to want to have biological kids and would need, her breasts for that, that this would be the type of woman, that would regret taking steps to divorce
Mhm.
herself from her sort of natural femininity
Mhm.
and womanhood. Like to me, that wasn't very shocking. And I also thought, well, if this is the type of woman that regrets transition, that's not me. Therefore, I'm a true transsexual.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because it's often like the stories of women like me who are heterosexual, who tend to be very feminine that proliferate the most. But I've spoken to a lot of detransitioners personally, and a good chunk of them are gay men and often butch lesbian women whose dysphoria was connected to their discomfort around their sexuality.
Yeah,
But you don't often hear that.
right. You don't. And it's pretty odd that it's not being discussed because the original cohorts, both of males and females, well, the original male cohort of when we're talking about the transitions that were done in the post Christine Jorgensen era in Europe, and most of this took place in the Netherlands, like the men existed in three main categories: the dysphoric men. Some of them had body dysmorphia. Some of them were very effeminate homosexuals, and there were other men who were the fetishistic
Mhm.
crossdressers. So we've seen these categories that later, Ray Blanchard condensed into the two type typology of the homosexual transsexual and the autogynephilic transsexual. But with the women in the original cohorts of patients that were writing the doctor that treated Christine Jorgensen, the women all had the same sort of presenting typology, which is that they were all same sex attracted. They didn't actually have any particular distress around their bodies, but their motivations, as they expressed in these letters to this, I believe, Danish endocrinologist, were that they wanted to marry their female friend
Mm.
and that's why they were transitioning. And in San Francisco in the 90s, a lot of there were I've heard from older lesbians that there would be mostly men outside of gay and lesbian bars telling these women, oh, I have what you need, and handing them testosterone. So butch lesbians were, as far as the female cohort, really the original cohort. And so it's kind of wild that, I mean, it's obviously alarming what's happening with all these teenage girls, and it becomes, really alarming because a lot of these teenage girls are very gender conforming
Mm.
or don't express some kind of, discomfort around their sex or confusion around it until they discover these ideas online. And then they declare a transgender identity. Their parents get, understandably incredibly concerned, and they're saying, wait a second, I know about transgender people, but I don't think this is my child. And so it seems like the parents with the more conforming children tend to question this a little bit more. Like if they are
Mm.
to question the dogma at all, they're more likely to question it when their daughter was very conforming before. Whereas they're more likely to believe that, oh, maybe my daughter does have a male soul
Yep.
if she was a very tomboyish child. And so I think that that's why we're seeing a preponderance of stories that are more like yours, because the tragedy becomes very clear when a young woman who doesn't even know who she grows up to be straight, but she's had testosterone and she's had her breasts removed, and she's very feminine, but she's been masculinized by these hormones. Like it's the gravity and the weight of that injustice is incredibly like poignantly
Mm.
clear. But a lot of people don't realize that kids who are going to grow up to be gay, lesbian, and bisexual equally deserve to grow into healthy bodies that are intact.
Absolutely. Because whereas with these heterosexual girls and women, right? I mean, the fact that they've gotten their breasts taken away and the chance to develop a more feminine form and potentially their fertility, it hits a lot harder at first. But that's not the only thing that's being taken away. I mean, gay people also have the rights to those things, and even if they decide not to have children, they still have parts of their bodies taken away from them. They still have their health compromised and potentially their sexual function as well. Their ability to have healthy romantic relationships. That's a major part of that.
Trans ideology sees the human body as basically like Mr. Potato Head, some kind of customizable form with a bunch of parts that can just be taken away and added on. But really, the body is an ecosystem where all of our different, bodily systems and our parts are just kind of intertwined with all these functions. And if you disrupt any one of those functions, it can cause issues not only with the functions that were disrupted, but with like any other part of the body. Like it's just so incredibly irresponsible, to act as if to play into the mind games of trans ideology and basically say that, oh, the damage here is cosmetic as opposed to functional.
as well as psychological.
Absolutely.
So when would you really say that you had completely detransitioned?
I would attribute that moment to October 7th. Um, I was in Israel, and I was actually planning on being at one of the festivals that later got raided by Hamas,
Mm,
but our sober driver fell through because he was kind of sick of us, trying to organize any kind of outing with like 5 people, and all the people are like either Jews and Arabs, meaning just total planning chaos. Um,
you're literally just one step away.
yeah, and so because the sober ride fell through, and thank God we didn't buy the tickets beforehand, so we didn't feel compelled by the sunk cost fallacy to even further like seek out a ride to get ourselves there, which is another parallel with trans because you start and you've already invested so much and then you just need to go the rest of the way. So there's another parallel. But yeah, basically, I was one step away from a horrific outcome. And so instead, on October 6th, I decided to go to a peace event between Jewish and Arab children in a Bedouin village. And in this event, the kids were playing together and they didn't even need a common language. They just, by the end of it, picked up a few words of Arabic or Hebrew or whatever they were speaking. And it was, if one of the kids fell down, it was really just the nearest adult to them who helped them and who comforted them.
Mm,
And it was like such a hopeful and optimistic, activity to be engaged in. And that was on the 6th of October. And I made a bunch of
just
posts
before.
and I made a bunch of posts, and I was so emotional and I was saying like, guys, like what we need to keep doing is this, like we can't count on any of these peace accords to work. We can't count on any of these terrorist groups in the region. We can't count on anybody but ourselves to bring about peace. We just need to educate our kids together. We need to make sure they speak each other's languages. We need to show them that they're not each other's enemies, that they're each other's neighbors and each other's potential best friends. And I was like, I was so hopeful on the 6th. And then,
And it just got completely destroyed.
yeah, I woke up on October 7th at 8 in the morning to a siren. And the city I was in, we didn't normally get rockets during war. So I thought that at first they were just testing the system. But then we just kept getting bombarded, bombarded, bombarded by sirens. And so I never had a chance to put my binder on because that thing takes like a long time to wriggle yourself into, especially if you have larger breasts and especially if you're sweaty and nervous from running. And I just, I kept hearing these sirens and I didn't know what was going on. And so I was still worried that people would see my breasts, even as I was like running for my life. Like I was still totally captured by this ideology, even though by this point in time, I knew that it was all like totally irrational. And I had already met detransitioners in real life.
It's hard to let go of.
It's hard. It's so hard to let go of. Like I knew I would never be able to become a man, but everybody in that neighborhood knew me as a man. And so it became practical. So I just had to layer a bunch of shirts up and just run for it. And it was in the process of really running, because there were so many sirens and so many interceptions. And it was like the ground was shaking underneath me. And I had to run for my life without the constriction of the binder, which I had really not done.
What did it feel like?
It was uncomfortable psychologically and physically. But in that moment, in those moments of psychological and physical discomfort, I really understood that while I had spent half of my life believing that my gender nonconformity is evidence of the fact that my healthy female body existing in its natural and healthy state is existing in a state of pathology, which needs to be remedied with a series of experimental and dangerous hormonal and surgical interventions. That actually, the entire time I was wrong, that actually my body was the only thing that I had, and my body was capable. My body was capable of allowing me to run, from one bomb shelter to the next and back to the house and saving my life. And that I need to do everything I possibly can to maintain my body, in its intact state. And I also additionally realized that, I never expected this war to happen. I was at a peace event the day before. I was supposed to be at the party, which I had only later, realized that was the party that I was supposed to be at. Um, and I couldn't predict that the war happened, and I didn't know how long it was going to last. And I know that war interrupts supply chains pretty
Right.
fundamentally. And so, like, women who take testosterone, this atrophies their reproductive system and they need to get it taken out. And often they get their ovaries removed, meaning that they can't produce their own hormones if they somehow like can't access pharmaceutical hormones. And, in that moment, it became really real to me because I just didn't expect any of this to happen.
And you
Um,
realize just how unsustainable it was.
yeah, like in order to survive in a chaotic environment like war, you know, you like it's already a major liability if you have something like diabetes and you can't get to the doctor and get your insulin. But if I were to have all these medical complications, some of which I would never be able to predict, um, and I did this to myself, if I had made myself reliant upon pharmaceutical industries, like I realized in that moment, really, especially on October 7th, like that would be unconscionable and that I need to keep my body fully intact in order to survive
It's
chaos and
almost
war.
it's almost like there's a reason why this ideology really only shows up in the first world. So
Yeah.
when did you decide to, I guess, go back to referring yourself as a woman?
So I guess it started with just a few friends. Like as I was encountering these ideas, these gender critical ideas, there were a few friends, the ones who knew that I was female, who I would express doubt to. But where I'd say that I actually meaningfully left my male identity behind was when I left Israel, about a week after October 7th, and I moved back to the United States. And that's really the first time in which, I totally gave up the male identity. And so it's really not even been a year of I guess embracing my true authentic self, not in
You're
an
very early
ideological,
in.
yes, not in an ideological way, but in a logical and material way. So it's all very recent.
And you once told me that coming to the GenSpec conference in Denver this last November was a major part of that. That solidified your decision to go back.
Yeah, like I had actually been to a GenSpec conference before in Ireland, but I had not even desisted in any meaningful way by then. But when I went to this conference in Denver, uh, and I met you, and I was just so depressed. Like before I went to this conference, I was like mourning the loss of my friends. I was mourning the loss of my country. I was I was not a depressive kid, even when I was trans identified. My homeostasis was very happy, but war shattered me. Like war just broke me. But then I met you, and we made bracelets, and we talked about like the restrictions of religious Judaism, and we talked about Shabbat friendly toilet paper. And for the first time since October 7th, I laughed. Like I actually laughed. And I started to like, whereas beforehand I was dealing with the psychological aftermath of, living a lie for so many years and not knowing who I actually am because for half of my life I was hijacked by these false beliefs about myself. And then on the other hand, I was dealing with the fallout of war and like
Mhm.
hearing airplanes and motorcycles and just freaking out because it reminded me of a rocket. And I was just seeped in all of these negative emotions. But then, at the conference, like I met you and I met a lot of other detransitioners and I laughed for the first time and I realized like actually like there's joy in this path. Like there is joy even amidst incomprehensible tragedy. And so like I'll be forever grateful to you and to meeting you and becoming friends because you really gave me the laughter that I really needed to start the process of recovering, both from 12 years of gender lies and from, Hamas. And between those two experiences, I honestly could not tell you which one of them has been more like psychologically harmful.
I mean, your story, it gives me a lot of gratitude in more ways than one, especially with your experiences with the war. It makes me incredibly grateful that my home is here in the United States. And it gives me this perspective that I didn't know I had of just how much privilege I really have just to be to have been here. And I'm incredibly grateful that you made it out safe and sound, not only out of the transgender ideology, but also of that wartime environments and your strength to get through that and to tell your story the way that you are.
Thank you so much, Chloe.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.